Montana Territory, 1883, the year the Northern Pacific Railroad completed its transcontinental line through the heart of the frontier, binding east to west with iron and steam. But there were still places the railroad could not reach, settlements so remote that they existed in a kind of temporal void, caught between the old world and the new. Places where the mail came once a month if the weather held, carried by solitary riders who knew every gulch and canyon, every creek, crossing, and Indian trail. Places where winter could arrive in September and stay until May, where a man could freeze to death between his barn and his house, where loneliness was a physical presence that sat at your table and slept in your bed. One such place was Coldwater Station, a mail stop and trading post in the Bitterroot Valley, nestled in the shadow of the Montana Rockies. It consisted of a log building that served as post office, general store, and saloon, a stable, a blacksmith's forge that operated sporadically, and perhaps 24 scattered homesteads within a day's ride. The nearest town of any size was Missoula, 60 miles northwest through mountain passes that became impassable from November through April. During those long winter months, Coldwater Station and its surrounding settlements existed in almost complete isolation, cut off from the rest of the world by walls of snow and cold that seemed almost deliberate in their cruelty. The post office was run by a man named Samuel Greaves, a former Union telegraph operator who had come west after the war to escape the ghosts of Shiloh and Antietam. He was 42 years old, though the frontier had aged him beyond his years, carving deep lines into his face and turning his hair the color of dirty snow. His left hand was missing its ring and pinky fingers, lost to frostbite during his first Montana winter, before he learned that steel tools could freeze to bare skin in seconds, before he understood that the cold here was not merely an absence of warmth, but a presence, a living thing that waited patiently for you to make a mistake. Samuel kept the mail sorted in pigeonholes behind the counter, each labeled with a family name or a lone surname: Henderson, O'Malley, Vickers, Chen. Names of people scattered across a landscape so vast that you could ride for days and see nothing but grass and sky, broken only by the dark line of cottonwoods that marked a creek, or the distant smudge of smoke from a settler's cabin. The mail came irregularly, carried by riders who contracted with the Territorial Postal Service, men who knew the country and were willing to risk their necks for the modest fee the government paid. For 3 years, the primary mail carrier for the Coldwater route had been a man named Jacob Thorne. He was a wiry, taciturn individual in his mid-30s, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look past you rather than at you, and a long brown beard that he wore tucked into his coat. He rode a sturdy bay gelding and carried a Winchester rifle, a Colt revolver, and very little else. He did not drink when he came through Coldwater Station, did not socialize, did not share stories around the stove on cold nights. He collected the outgoing mail, delivered the incoming, accepted his payment from Samuel, and rode on. There was something faintly unsettling about him, though Samuel could never quite articulate what it was. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with an economy of motion that seemed almost mechanical, or perhaps it was his silence, the way he would stand at the counter while Samuel sorted through the mailbag without once making small talk about the weather or the state of the trails. But Jacob Thorne was reliable. Every 4 weeks, give or take a few days depending on conditions, he would appear on the trail from Missoula, his horse moving at a steady walk, his posture straight in the saddle despite whatever hardships he had endured on the journey. And every 4 weeks, the people of the Coldwater settlements would receive their letters from distant relatives, their newspapers from back east, their seed catalogs and medical almanacs and all the other small connections to the wider world that made frontier isolation bearable. Then, in late September of 1883, Jacob Thorne failed to appear on schedule. The first week past his expected arrival, Samuel was not concerned. Delays were common, especially as autumn deepened and the weather became unpredictable. Perhaps there had been heavy rains that swelled the creeks. Perhaps Thorne's horse had thrown a shoe. Perhaps there had been trouble with the Salish, though the tribes in this region had been peaceful since the end of the Nez Perce War 6 years earlier. By the second week, Samuel began to worry. The people who came into the trading post asked about the mail with increasing frequency and mounting frustration. Martha Henderson needed medicine for her husband's lung condition, which they had ordered from a supplier in Helena. Young Thomas O'Malley was waiting for a letter from the girl he had left behind in Illinois. A letter that would determine whether he stayed on this godless frontier or scraped together the money to return east. And everyone was waiting for news from family and friends, those thin sheets of paper that were sometimes the only thing standing between a settler and the crushing weight of loneliness. 3 weeks past the expected date, Samuel sent word to Missoula via a trapper who was heading that direction. The response came back 10 days later, carried by a different rider who had been hired to make a single run. Jacob Thorne had never arrived in Missoula. He had left Coldwater Station on his previous run in late August, heading back toward Missoula as he always did, and had not been seen since. The territorial marshal had been notified. A search party had ridden the route, but found nothing. No sign of Thorne or his horse, no evidence of an accident or foul play. He had simply vanished somewhere in the 100 miles of wilderness between Coldwater Station and Missoula, swallowed by the forest and the mountains, as if he had never existed at all. The temporary rider who brought this news was a young man named Peter Gillespie, barely 20 years old, with the soft hands of someone who had not spent much time in the saddle. He made it clear that he had no intention of taking over the route permanently. He would make this one delivery, collect his fee, and return to the relative civilization of Missoula. Samuel could not blame him. The frontier consumed people. It had consumed Jacob Thorne, apparently, and no one could say how or why. October came, and with it, the first serious snow. The mountains turned white overnight, their peaks sharp against a sky the color of old pewter. The aspens in the valley turned gold and then lost their leaves in a matter of days, their naked white trunks standing like bones against the dark pine forest. The air took on that crystalline quality that comes with true cold. Each breath sharp in the lungs, each exhalation a cloud of vapor. Samuel began preparing for winter in earnest, stocking the root cellar, checking the integrity of the roof, making sure he had enough split wood to keep the stove burning through the months ahead. The mail situation remained unresolved. The Territorial Postal Service promised to send a new permanent rider, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and winter was coming fast. The people of Coldwater Station grew increasingly irritable. Letters piled up in Samuel's outgoing mail bin, waiting for a carrier who might not come until spring. And the incoming mail, wherever it was, whatever it contained, remained in Missoula, or perhaps scattered along the trail where Jacob Thorne had met his end. It was on a gray morning in the 3rd week of October when Samuel first saw the new rider. He was in the trading post portion of the building, helping Martha Henderson select a bolt of calico fabric, when he heard the sound of a horse outside. Through the window, he could see a figure dismounting, moving with that same economical motion that had characterized Jacob Thorne. For a moment, Samuel felt a surge of irrational hope. Perhaps Thorne had not died after all. Perhaps he had been injured, had recovered, had returned to his route. But when the door opened and the rider stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, Samuel saw immediately that this was not Jacob Thorne. This man was taller, broader in the shoulders, with dark hair and a heavy beard streaked with gray. He wore a long coat made of buffalo hide, and his hat was pulled low over his eyes. There was a mailbag slung over his shoulder, the leather worn smooth with use and darkened by weather and sweat. The man approached the counter without speaking. Martha Henderson moved aside, clutching her fabric sample, her eyes wide. There was something about the rider that commanded space, that made you want to step back and give him room. Samuel cleared his throat, trying to find his professional voice. "Can I help you?" he said. The rider set the mailbag on the counter. His hands were gloved in leather so old it had gone black and hard as iron. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, like wind over gravel. "Mail delivery," he said, "for Coldwater Station." Samuel stared at the bag. Relief and confusion warred in his chest. "You from the Territorial Service?" he asked. The rider did not answer directly. He simply stood there, waiting, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. Samuel reached for the mailbag, untied the leather strap, and began removing the contents. Letters, newspapers, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He sorted them automatically, his hands performing the familiar task, while his mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Where had he come from? Why had the Postal Service not sent word that a new rider had been assigned to the route? Martha Henderson was still standing nearby, and Samuel saw her lean forward, slightly, trying to read the names on the letters. Suddenly she gasped, a sharp intake of breath that made Samuel look up. "That one," she said, pointing with a trembling finger. "That letter, that is for me, from my sister, from Abigail." Samuel glanced down at the envelope in his hand. It was addressed to Martha Henderson, Coldwater Station, Montana Territory, in a neat feminine script. The return address read, Abigail Marsh, Council Bluffs, Iowa. He held it out to Martha, but she did not take it immediately. She was staring at it as if it were a snake. "What is the matter?" Samuel asked. Martha's face had gone very pale. "My sister, Abigail," she said quietly. "She died last spring, in April, of cholera. I received the news in June." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint whistle of wind through the gaps in the window frame. Samuel looked at the letter again, turned it over. It was sealed with red wax, the kind that people used for important correspondence. The paper was good quality, heavy, and cream-colored. There was nothing obviously wrong with it, nothing to suggest it was anything other than what it appeared to be, a letter from one sister to another. "There must be some mistake," Samuel said. "Perhaps it was posted before she died. Perhaps it was delayed in the system." But even as he spoke, he knew the explanation did not quite fit. The postal system was slow, but not that slow. And there was something about the letter, something he could not quite name, that felt wrong. The temperature in the room seemed to have dropped, though the stove was burning steadily. Martha took the letter finally, her hands shaking. She turned it over several times, examining it from every angle, then carefully broke the seal. Samuel watched as she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside and began to read. Her lips moved silently. Her face went from pale to ashen. When she finished, she looked up at Samuel with eyes that held something beyond fear, something closer to existential horror. "It is dated 3 days ago," she whispered. It is in her handwriting. She speaks of things that happened after her death. She mentions my husband's illness, which began in August. She says she is sorry she cannot be here to help me. She says she watches over me still. The letter slipped from Martha's fingers and drifted to the floor. She turned, and walked out of the trading post without another word, moving like someone in a trance. Samuel heard the door close behind her, heard the fading sound of her footsteps in the snow. He looked at the rider, who had not moved from his position by the counter. The man's face was still shadowed, but Samuel thought he caught a glimpse of his eyes, and they were pale, so pale they were almost colorless, like holes in a mask. "Where did you get this mail?" Samuel asked. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, thin and uncertain. "From the dead," the rider said simply. Then he turned and walked out of the trading post, leaving the remaining letters and parcels on the counter. Samuel heard him mount his horse, heard the muffled sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. For a long moment, he stood frozen, staring at the pile of mail. Then slowly, he began to examine the letters more carefully. There were 11 pieces of correspondence in total. He recognized most of the addressees, people from the surrounding homesteads. But as he looked at the return addresses, a cold understanding began to seep into his bones like winter damp. Thomas O'Malley had a letter from Mary Catherine Doyle, the girl he had left behind in Illinois. Samuel happened to know that Mary Catherine had died of typhoid in July, because Thomas had received that very news in the last mail delivery before Jacob Thorne's disappearance. Carl Vickers had a letter from his father in Ohio. A man Samuel knew had passed away in 1881 because Carl had attended the funeral. Little Sophie Chen, whose family ran a small mining operation in the hills, had a letter from her grandmother in San Francisco, a woman who had died in the Great Fire of 1877 when Sophie was only 3 years old. Every single letter, as far as Samuel could determine, was from someone who was dead. He stood there in the empty trading post, surrounded by the mundane objects of frontier commerce, the bolts of fabric and sacks of flour and cans of preserved peaches, and felt reality itself begin to bend around him. This was not possible. The dead did not write letters. The dead did not post correspondence. The dead were silent, were still, were gone. And yet here, on the scarred wooden counter, was evidence that seemed to contradict everything he knew about the fundamental nature of existence. His first instinct was to burn the letters, to shove them into the stove, and let the fire consume them and whatever wrongness they represented. But something stopped him. These letters had been addressed to people, people who might be waiting for them, people who might need them. What right did he have to make that decision? And underneath that rationalization was something else, something he was ashamed to acknowledge: curiosity, a terrible, gnawing curiosity about what the letters contained, what messages the dead had sent back across the boundary that was supposed to be final and absolute. Over the next several hours, word spread through the settlement. People began arriving at the trading post, drawn by Martha Henderson's incoherent account of what had happened. They came through the snow, on foot and on horseback, their faces set with that peculiar expression of determined skepticism that frontier people wore when confronted with something that defied explanation. They demanded their mail, and Samuel gave it to them, watching as they opened the letters with hands that shook, reading words from parents and siblings and children and spouses who had been lowered into the ground months or years before. Thomas O'Malley read his letter from Mary Catherine and wept openly, tears streaming into his beard. The letter spoke of her love for him, her regret that she had not been strong enough to survive, her hope that he would find happiness in Montana. It was written in her handwriting, contained details and endearments that no one else could have known. Thomas clutched it to his chest and stumbled out into the snow, and Samuel did not see him again for several days. Carl Vickers read his letter from his father and became very still. Then he carefully folded it and placed it in his pocket, and left without speaking. His face had taken on a closed, shuttered expression, as if he had looked into something too bright or too dark and needed to seal himself off from it. Sophie Chen's parents did not open her letter in the trading post. They thanked Samuel formally, their faces unreadable, and took it home. Samuel learned later that the letter was in Chinese, written in Sophie's grandmother's hand, and it had made her mother scream and burn incense for 3 days straight. Not everyone who had received mail came to collect it. Some people, when they heard what the letters contained, refused to touch them. They stood at the edge of the trading post, looking at the envelopes that bore their names as if they were cursed objects, instruments of malevolent power. Samuel could not blame them. There was something fundamentally transgressive about what was happening, something that violated the natural order. Death was supposed to be final. The grave was supposed to be silent. These letters represented a kind of cosmic breach, a tearing of the veil that separated the living from the dead. As the days passed, and the first real winter storms began to howl down from the mountains, the writer became a recurring presence in Coldwater Station. He came without warning, always alone, always carrying his leather mail bag. He never spoke beyond the minimum necessary words. Mail delivery. He never ate at the trading post, never warmed himself by the stove, never accepted any hospitality beyond the standard postal fee that Samuel dutifully paid him from the government stipend. And every time he came, the letters he brought were from the dead. Samuel began to keep a record, writing down the names of the senders and the recipients, trying to find some pattern or logic to it, but there was none that he could discern. The dead who wrote seemed to be chosen at random. They were not all from the same time period. They were not all related to the recipients in the same way. Some had died recently, others years ago. Some had died peacefully, others violently. The only common thread was that they were all connected somehow to the people of Coldwater Station and its surrounding settlements. The effect on the community was profound and disturbing. Some people became obsessed with the letters, waiting desperately for the writer to appear, hoping for one more message from a lost loved one. They hung around the trading post, asking Samuel every day if the writer had come, if there was anything for them. Others became fearful and withdrawn, barricading themselves in their cabins, refusing to come to the trading post at all, as if proximity to the letters might somehow contaminate them. There were theological debates that lasted deep into the night. Clusters of settlers huddled around the trading post stove, trying to make sense of what was happening. The few religious people in the area argued about whether the letters were a miracle or a demonic deception. Father Morrison, a Catholic priest who served a small mission church 20 miles south, rode up through a blizzard to examine one of the letters and declared that it bore the mark of evil, that it was a trick of Satan designed to lead the faithful into error and despair. But others disagreed, said that God moved in mysterious ways, that perhaps this was a gift, a special dispensation that allowed the dead to comfort the living. Samuel himself did not know what to believe. He had never been a particularly religious man. The war had burned most of that out of him. But he knew that what was happening was wrong on some fundamental level. It was not right for the dead to speak. It was not natural. And yet the letters kept coming, and people kept reading them, and the boundary between the living and the dead became increasingly blurred and uncertain. In early November, Samuel received his own letter. He was alone in the trading post, taking inventory of the dwindling supplies, when he heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats outside. The writer entered, set his mailbag on the counter, and began removing letters. As he placed them one by one in front of Samuel, his hand paused over a particular envelope. He held it up, and Samuel saw his own name written in a script that made his heart stop. The letter was from his younger brother, Michael. Michael, who had died at Shiloh, shot through the lungs while charging a Confederate position on a bright April morning in 1862. Michael, who had bled out in Samuel's arms, coughing red froth, his last words a request for water that Samuel could not provide because the canteens were all empty and the creek was 200 yards away across open ground swept by enemy fire. Michael, who Samuel had not thought about for days at a time over the past 20 years, but whose death was a wound that had never fully healed, a grief that had calcified into a hard knot in the center of his chest. Samuel took the letter with hands that had gone numb. The writer watched him with those pale, empty eyes. Then, without a word, he collected his payment and left. Samuel stood alone in the trading post, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of it, the reality of it. The handwriting was Michael's. He was certain of it. The same slanted, hasty script that he had seen on dozens of letters during the war. Letters sent from camp, letters full of complaints about the food and the officers and the never-ending boredom, punctuated by moments of absolutely terror. He could not bring himself to open it, not immediately. He placed it on the counter and went about his work, trying to focus on the mundane tasks of tallying flour and beans, but his eyes kept returning to the letter. It sat there like a small white accusation. Finally, as the daylight faded and the trading post filled with shadows, he picked it up again and broke the seal. The letter was dated 3 days prior, just like Martha Henderson's had been. It was written in Michael's voice, casual and conversational, as if they were continuing a discussion they had started yesterday rather than 21 years ago. Michael wrote about Shiloh, about the charge, about the moment he realized he was hit. He wrote about what it felt like to die, the strange lightness that had come over him as the blood filled his lungs, the sense that he was floating above his body, looking down at Samuel's anguished face. He wrote that he understood why Samuel had been unable to get him water, that he had never blamed him, that the guilt Samuel carried was unnecessary and self-inflicted. Then the letter took a darker turn. Michael wrote about the place where the dead went, and his descriptions were fragmentary and difficult to parse, as if language itself was insufficient to capture what he was trying to convey. He spoke of a gray landscape, featureless and endless, where the dead walked in circles waiting for something that never came. He spoke of a hunger that could not be satisfied, a thirst that could not be quenched. He spoke of the knowledge that the living world continued without you, that you had become irrelevant, a memory that would fade with each passing year until you were forgotten entirely, as if you had never existed at all. And then, in the final paragraph, Michael wrote something that made Samuel's blood run cold. He wrote that the boundary between the living and the dead was not as solid as people believed. He wrote that there were thin places, cracks in the wall, and that sometimes things could pass through. He wrote that the rider was one such thing, a creature that existed in the space between, neither fully alive nor fully dead, a messenger who carried words from one side to the other. And he wrote that every time a letter was delivered, every time a living person read words from the dead, the boundary grew a little thinner, a little more permeable. "Be careful, Samuel," the letter concluded. "Be very careful. The dead should not speak to the living. It is not meant to be. And now that the door has been opened, it may be very difficult to close." Samuel read the letter 3 times, each reading filling him with a deeper sense of dread. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, next to where his heart hammered against his ribs. He looked around the trading post, at the shelves and the stove and the counter, all the solid, familiar objects of his daily life, and they seemed suddenly fragile and temporary, like stage props that could be swept away at any moment. That night, he did not sleep. He sat by the stove, feeding it wood, watching the flames dance behind the iron grating. He thought about Michael's words. He thought about the rider, that tall figure in the buffalo coat with the pale, empty eyes. He thought about all the letters that had been delivered, all the boundaries that had been crossed, all the unnatural communications between the living and the dead. And he wondered what would happen if the boundary collapsed entirely, if the wall between the worlds came down. The winter deepened. Snow piled against the walls of the trading post until Samuel had to shovel his way out each morning. The temperature dropped so low that the nails in the walls contracted and made sharp popping sounds like distant gunfire. The wind came down from the mountains and screamed around the building, a sound like voices, like the cries of people lost in the wilderness. And through it all, the rider continued to come, appearing out of the snow like a ghost, delivering his letters from the dead. The community began to fracture. There were arguments, accusations. Some people claimed that the letters were bringing bad luck, that ever since the rider had arrived, things had gone wrong. Livestock died mysteriously. A barn burned down despite the snow and cold. A child fell through ice and nearly drowned. Were these events related to the letters, or were they simply the normal hardships of frontier life? It was impossible to say, but people needed someone or something to blame, and the rider became a focal point for their fear and anger. A group of men, led by Carl Vickers, decided to confront the rider the next time he appeared. They waited at the trading post, armed with rifles and grim determination. When the rider came, in the dead of a January night, they surrounded him, demanded answers. Who was he? Where did he come from? How did he get letters from the dead? Where was Jacob Thorne? The rider stood in the center of their circle, unperturbed. Snow swirled around him, caught in the light from the trading post windows. When he finally spoke, his voice was that same low rasp, like wind over gravel. "I am what I am," he said. "A carrier, a messenger. I bring what needs to be brought." Carl Vickers, emboldened by the presence of the other men, stepped forward and grabbed the rider's coat. "Where is Jacob Thorne?" he demanded. "What did you do to him?" The rider looked down at Carl's hand on his coat, then up at Carl's face. His eyes in the lamplight were not pale, Samuel realized. They were empty, completely empty, like looking into a void. Carl made a strangled sound and released his grip, stumbling backward. "Jacob Thorne is where all riders go eventually," the rider said. "He delivered his last letter. Now he is delivered." "What does that mean?" Carl shouted. His voice was high and strained, on the edge of panic. The rider did not answer. He simply turned and walked toward his horse. The circle of men parted to let him through, their courage evaporating. Samuel watched from the doorway of the trading post as the rider mounted and rode off into the darkness, the snow already beginning to cover his tracks. After that confrontation, the men were subdued and uneasy. Carl Vickers, in particular, was changed. He had looked into those empty eyes and seen something that had shaken him to his core. He became withdrawn, stopped coming to the trading post except when absolutely necessary. Samuel heard from others that Carl spent his days sitting by his window, staring out at the snow, waiting for something he could not or would not name. In February, during a brief thaw, a trapper passing through brought news from Missoula. Jacob Thorne's body had been found. A prospector had discovered it in a ravine about 30 miles west of Coldwater Station, partially covered by snow and scavenged by animals, but still identifiable by the items found with it: the Winchester rifle, the saddlebags with the Postal Service markings. The cause of death was unclear. There were no obvious signs of violence, no gunshot wounds or broken bones. It appeared that Thorne had simply dismounted, lain down in the snow, and died. The authorities speculated that he might have suffered a heart attack or stroke, some sudden medical event that had killed him quickly. But Samuel, hearing this news, thought about the rider's words. Jacob Thorne is where all riders go eventually. He delivered his last letter. Now he is delivered. And he wondered if Thorne had not died of natural causes at all, but had instead been claimed by whatever force or entity employed the rider, had been taken as payment or replacement or sacrifice. The thought was too terrible to contemplate fully, so Samuel pushed it away and focused on the practical matters of survival. The winter was proving to be one of the hardest in years. Food supplies were running low. Several families were on the verge of starvation. The isolation was complete and absolute. The snow too deep to travel, except in the most dire emergencies. Coldwater Station became a tiny island of humanity in an ocean of white, and the people huddled together for warmth and companionship, trying not to think about the rider and his letters from the dead. But the letters kept coming. Through blizzards and ice storms, through cold so intense that metal shattered and water froze solid in seconds, the rider appeared at intervals that seemed to follow no earthly calendar. Sometimes he came every few days. Sometimes weeks would pass without any sign of him. But he always came eventually, and he always carried his leather mailbag, and the letters inside were always from the dead. Samuel noticed that the letters were changing. The early ones had been comforting, full of love and reassurance. But as winter wore on, the tone shifted. The dead began to write about their loneliness, their isolation, their yearning to return to the world of the living. They wrote about the gray place where they existed, how it was growing darker, colder, how they could feel themselves fading. They wrote that they needed to be remembered, needed the living to think about them and speak their names, because memory was the only thing that kept them from disappearing entirely into the void. And some of the letters contained requests. Could the recipient visit the grave? Could they speak aloud the name of the deceased? Could they perform some small ritual or action that would strengthen the connection between the worlds? These requests were usually phrased politely, even desperately, but there was an undertone of demand to them, a sense that refusal would have consequences. Martha Henderson, who had been one of the first to receive a letter, received several more from her dead sister, Abigail. Each one was more insistent than the last. Abigail needed Martha to come to Iowa, to visit her grave, to bring flowers and say prayers. She needed Martha to tell her that she was not forgotten, that her life had mattered. The letters became increasingly frantic, the handwriting less controlled, the sentences fragmented and strange. Martha showed the latest letter to Samuel with shaking hands. "I think she is angry at me," Martha whispered. "I think she is angry that I cannot go to Iowa, that I am trapped here for the winter. I think she blames me for leaving her alone in the ground." Samuel tried to reassure her, but he had no comfort to offer. The truth was that he did not understand what was happening, did not know if the letters were truly from the dead, or some elaborate deception. And if they were from the dead, he did not know what power the dead might have, what they might be capable of doing if their requests were ignored. In early March, Martha Henderson disappeared. Samuel noticed her absence when she failed to come to the trading post for several days in a row. He rode out to her homestead through the snow and found the cabin empty, the door standing open, the interior already drifted with white. There was no sign of violence, no indication of where she had gone. Her husband, bedridden with his lung condition, was delirious with fever and could provide no useful information. He kept muttering about Abigail, about how Abigail had come in the night and called to Martha through the window, about how Martha had gotten dressed and walked out into the snow without a word. They found Martha's body 3 days later, frozen solid, about half a mile from her cabin. She was lying on her back, her arms crossed over her chest, her face peaceful. There were no tracks leading to or from her body, which should have been impossible in the deep snow, but there it was. And in her hands, clutched against her heart, was a letter from Abigail. Samuel did not read that letter. He could not bring himself to touch it, but he saw it later, after Martha had been buried in the frozen ground, after her husband had followed her into death a week later. The letter was part of her effects, and someone had placed it with her few possessions. Samuel caught a glimpse of the writing, and what he saw made him turn away quickly. The words were not English. They were not any language he recognized. They were symbols and marks that hurt to look at, that seemed to writhe and shift on the page. After Martha's death, the fear in Coldwater Station became palpable. People began to refuse their letters from the rider. When he came, they would not approach the trading post, would hide in their cabins and wait for him to leave. But the rider did not stop coming, and the letters did not stop accumulating. Samuel, as postmaster, felt obligated to accept them, to sort them, to keep them available for their intended recipients. But the pile grew larger, the unclaimed letters stacking up in the pigeonholes behind the counter. And then people began to report that they could hear voices, soft whispers that came in the night, calling their names, speaking words they could not quite make out. Shadows that moved at the edges of vision, figures that appeared in windows and then vanished when you looked directly at them. The boundary between the living and the dead was thinning, just as Michael's letter had warned, and things were beginning to slip through. Samuel felt it himself, a growing sense of wrongness that permeated the trading post. The building felt colder than it should, even with the stove burning. There were sounds that had no source, footsteps in empty rooms, the rustle of paper when no paper was moving. And sometimes, when he was alone, he would catch a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision, a tall figure in a buffalo coat standing in the shadows, watching him with empty eyes. One night in late March, unable to sleep, Samuel took all the unclaimed letters and carried them outside. The snow was beginning to melt, the first true sign that winter might eventually release its grip. He built a fire in the space behind the trading post and began feeding the letters into it, one by one. They burned reluctantly, the paper curling and blackening but not catching easily, as if even the fire was hesitant to consume them. But eventually they burned, and the smoke that rose from them was thick and black, and smelled like nothing Samuel had ever smelled before, something between incense and decay. As the last letter turned to ash, Samuel heard a sound behind him. He turned and saw the rider standing there, his horse nearby, his empty eyes reflecting the firelight. "They were not yours to burn," the rider said. "They were never opened," Samuel replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "They were refused. They have no purpose." The rider was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "The dead do not stop speaking, simply because the living refuse to listen. The words still exist. The need still exists. You have solved nothing." "Then what do we do?" Samuel asked. "How do we stop this? How do we make it right?" The rider looked at him, and for the first time, Samuel thought he saw something like emotion in that impassive face. Or perhaps it was just the flickering shadows cast by the dying fire. "You cannot make it right," the rider said. "You can only endure it. The door has been opened. It will not close until it is ready." "Who opened it?" Samuel demanded. "Was it you? Are you doing this?" "I am only the messenger," the rider said. "I carry what is given to me. I deliver where I am told. I am not the cause. I am merely a symptom. Then what is the cause?" The rider gestured vaguely toward the horizon, toward the mountains, toward the vast empty spaces of the frontier. "This land," he said, "this place, It is thin here, the veil between worlds. Too much death, too much loneliness, too much grief. It builds up like water behind a dam. Eventually, it breaks through. Can it be stopped? Samuel asked. Everything stops eventually, the rider said, but not yet, not for a while yet. And then he mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. Samuel stood by the dying fire, watching the last embers fade, feeling the weight of those words settle over him like a shroud. Spring came slowly to Montana that year. The snow retreated up the mountainsides, revealing a landscape that looked both familiar and strange, as if the winter had altered it in subtle ways. The creeks ran high with meltwater. The grass began to green. The aspens budded and leafed. And with the thaw came the first mail delivery from Missoula by a regular living, completely ordinary postal rider. The new rider was a cheerful young man who talked too much and knew nothing about what had happened during the winter. He delivered his letters, collected the outgoing mail, accepted his payment, and rode on. His letters were from living people about mundane things, crop reports, and family news and business matters. They were blessedly, wonderfully ordinary. But the other rider, the one in the buffalo coat, did not stop coming. He continued to appear at intervals, always carrying his leather mailbag, always delivering letters from the dead. The difference was that now people had a choice. They could accept the letters from the dead, or they could refuse them and wait for the regular mail. Most chose to refuse, but not everyone. Some people, driven by grief or curiosity or desperate hope, continued to accept the letters. Thomas O'Malley took every letter that arrived from Mary Catherine, read them over and over until the paper wore thin from handling. Carl Vickers eventually began accepting letters from his father again, though he never spoke about what they contained. Little Sophie Chen's family accepted the letters from her grandmother, and Sophie herself seemed to take comfort from them, though her parents grew increasingly worried about her habit of talking to empty air as if someone was there. Samuel stopped accepting letters from Michael. After that first one, he had received several more, each one darker and more disturbing than the last. Michael's final letter, which arrived in April, contained a warning. He wrote that the gray place was changing, that something was happening to the dead, that they were becoming less themselves and more something else. He wrote that Samuel should not read any more letters, should not have any more contact, should try to forget that any of this had ever happened. Samuel took that advice to heart. When the writer came with letters addressed to him, he refused them. The writer did not argue, simply returned them to his mailbag and departed. And gradually, over the course of the spring and summer, the letters from Michael stopped coming. But the writer himself did not stop. He continued his rounds, continued his deliveries, a permanent fixture in the landscape now, as much a part of Coldwater Station as the trading post itself. People grew accustomed to him, in the way that people grow accustomed to any persistent strangeness. The children no longer stared when he rode through. The adults nodded to him, a wary acknowledgement. He became part of the rhythm of life, neither welcomed nor rejected, simply there. Samuel learned to live with it. He continued his work as postmaster, sorting the mail from both riders, the living and the whatever the other one was. He maintained the trading post, served the community, endured the winters, and welcomed the springs. And he tried not to think too deeply about the implications of what had happened, about what it meant that the boundary between life and death had become so permeable, about what other things might be able to cross over if letters could. Years passed. Coldwater Station grew slightly, then shrank, then grew again, following the unpredictable fortunes of frontier settlements. The railroad never came through, despite promises and plans. The settlement remained isolated, remote, a place on the edge of the map. People came and went. Some prospered, some failed, some died, and were buried in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley. And the rider continued his route. Samuel grew older, his hair turning completely white, his body becoming bent and stiff with age and old injuries. He trained a successor to take over the trading post, a young man who had come west from Pennsylvania and who listened with polite skepticism when Samuel tried to explain about the two riders and the letters from the dead. The young man thought it was frontier mythology, the kind of tall tale that old-timers like to tell to spook newcomers. He would learn differently soon enough. On a cold morning in November of 1895, 12 years after the rider had first appeared, Samuel Greaves died in his sleep. They found him in his bed in the small room behind the trading post, his face peaceful, his mangled left hand resting on his chest. He was 64 years old, which was considered a good long life for a frontier settler. They buried him in the cemetery on the hill, next to Martha Henderson and her husband, and all the others who had lived and died in this thin place between the mountains and the plains. 3 days after the funeral, the rider came to the trading post. The new postmaster, whose name was William Something, Samuel's successor, had already half forgotten it in his grief, was sorting through the mail when the door opened, and the tall figure in the buffalo coat entered. William looked up, opened his mouth to offer a greeting, and then stopped. There was something about this man that made casual pleasantries seem inappropriate. The rider set his mailbag on the counter and began removing letters. William accepted them automatically, started to sort them, and then paused. One of the letters was addressed to him, care of Coldwater Station. The return address read, Samuel Greaves, Montana Territory. William stared at the letter, his hands beginning to shake. Samuel Greaves was dead. He had helped carry the coffin himself. This was impossible. The rider stood at the counter, watching him with eyes that William suddenly realized were empty, completely empty, like holes cut in the fabric of reality. "Read it," the rider said. His voice was like wind over gravel, like the sound of earth falling on a coffin lid. William broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the letter. It was in Samuel's handwriting, neat and careful despite his missing fingers. It was dated 2 days ago, the day after Samuel had died. The letter was brief. Samuel wrote that he wanted William to know that the stories were true, that the rider was real, that the letters from the dead were genuine. He wrote that William should be careful, should be kind, should remember that both the living and the dead deserved compassion. He wrote that being a postmaster in Coldwater Station was more than just sorting mail. It was being a gatekeeper, a guardian of the boundary between worlds. And he wrote that he was sorry for the burden he was passing on, but that someone had to do it, and he had faith that William was strong enough. The letter ended with a single sentence: "Do not be afraid of the rider. He is only doing his job, just as you will do yours." William looked up from the letter, but the rider was already gone. Through the window, he could see the tall figure mounting his horse, preparing to ride on to the next stop on his eternal route. And William understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that this was his life now. This was what it meant to be postmaster in Coldwater Station, to stand at the intersection of the living and the dead, to sort letters from both worlds, to bear witness to the impossible and continue anyway. He placed Samuel's letter carefully in a drawer, next to where he kept the official postal records. Then he returned to his work, sorting the rest of the mail, preparing it for distribution. Outside, the November wind began to rise, carrying with it the first whispers of winter. And somewhere in the mountains, on a trail that existed in the spaces between, the rider continued his endless route, carrying letters from people who had already died to people who were not yet ready to join them. The frontier has many legends, many ghost stories, many tales of the strange and unexplained. But in the small settlements scattered across Montana, from the Bitterroot Valley to the plains beyond, there are those who know that the rider is not a legend. He is real. He comes with the mail, appears out of the snow or the rain or the dust, delivers his letters from the dead, and rides on. Some say he is death himself, moonlighting as a postal carrier. Others say he is a spirit, a revenant, something that was never alive to begin with. Still others believe he is a man, an ordinary man cursed to carry out this terrible duty as penance for some unknown sin. The truth, if there is such a thing as truth in matters like this, is probably more complex and more simple than any of those explanations. The truth is that in places where the veil between worlds grows thin, where isolation and loneliness and grief accumulate like snow in drifts, strange things become possible. The dead can speak, the living can hear, and messengers can pass between, carrying words that should never be written, delivering news from a country that should have no postal service. The rider has been seen as recently as last winter, according to reports from the few remaining settlements in the region. Coldwater Station itself is long gone, abandoned in the early 1900s when the promise of the railroad finally proved false, and people moved on to more promising lands. But the rider does not need Coldwater Station. He rides his circuit still, delivering to whoever remains, whoever is isolated enough, lonely enough, grief-stricken enough to thin the veil. If you find yourself on the Montana frontier, in one of those small settlements that cling to existence against all logic and sense, and you see a tall figure on horseback, approaching through the weather, carrying a leather mail bag that has been worn smooth by impossible years of use, you might want to consider whether you truly want to receive the mail he carries. Because some letters are better left unread, some doors are better left unopened, some boundaries between the living and the dead are better left intact. And if he stops at your door, if he hands you an envelope with your name on it and a return address from someone you buried months or years ago, you have a choice to make. You can accept it, break the seal, read the words from beyond the grave, or you can refuse it, send it back, maintain the boundary that is supposed to exist between this world and the next. Choose carefully, because once you read a letter from the dead, once you acknowledge that communication across that final boundary is possible, you cannot unread it. You cannot unknow it. The wall has been breached, and there is no way to repair it. You will spend the rest of your days wondering what else might cross over, what other messages might arrive, what the dead might want from you, now that they know you are listening. The rider will come regardless of your choice. He always comes. He is patient, eternal, inexorable as winter. He has all the time in the world, because time means something different in the places he travels through. He will offer you the letter, and he will wait for your answer, and his empty eyes will watch you with neither judgment nor sympathy, because he is only the messenger. And the dead, wherever they are, whatever they have become, will continue to write their letters, will continue to speak across the void, will continue to reach out with words written on paper that should not exist, carried by a rider who should not be possible, delivered to people who thought they had said their final goodbyes. Because love does not end with death, neither does need or hunger, or the desire to be remembered. And in the thin places of the world, where the frontier stretched endlessly, and the loneliness was so profound it became a physical force, those emotions can breach even the most fundamental of boundaries. The rider who delivers letters from people who had already died is still riding. He is riding right now, somewhere in the mountains, somewhere in the snow, somewhere in that gray space between the living world and whatever lies beyond. His horse's hooves make no sound on the frozen ground. His breath does not cloud in the cold. And in his mailbag are letters, so many letters, more letters than could ever be delivered in a single lifetime. But he has more than a lifetime to deliver them. He has forever, and forever is a very long route indeed.